everybody, whether they're migrants or not, has a vulnerability to climate change, which is determined by what your livelihood is, for instance, what your income and wealth level is, what your condition of habitation is, where you live, what's going on in the neighborhood you live in. Are you in a conflict zone? Or are you in a peaceful zone where there are public services? And importantly, what the governance situation is, whether it's at the community level or the higher levels of governance, say national governance, for instance. That affects everybody, and everything that climate change throws at the human race is going to be eventually, the consequences are going to be reflected in how exposed and vulnerable people were and how they reacted in the process. So in terms of migrants specifically, they are in a particularly vulnerable situation because they are either in transit from where they used to be to someplace where they now think they want to be. And in the process, they don't have always the same protections that a good governance system might offer. In fact, they might be leaving a place where there is disaggregated governance, might be in a shambles. Things might be in conflict. They might not have had adequate livelihood. It might be a sudden, the response to a sudden situation, like some kind of climate-related disaster, or it might be related to some sort of long-term consideration of the climate's going downhill, so to speak. I'm not going to be able to make a livelihood much longer, for instance, subsistence farmers, and they want to go somewhere else. And it could be so it could be an emergency decision or a thought-out decision. And in each of those cases, this additional degree of vulnerability due to climate change. People who are on the move are vulnerable to climate change because they're on the move, maybe from one place to in the zone that they don't want to go. Maybe some people are moving on boats and they get essentially run over by a tropical cyclone. That can happen. So, and then they may have limited knowledge of the place they're going to, and they may not have adequately considered what the climate conditions are in the places they're going to, so that just movement itself in the situation where the climate is changing might be perilous. It might be based on wrong information. It might be based on information that was good 15 years ago, but in a changing climate isn't good anymore. So climate change and the act of migration interact in ways which can be additionally perilous to the migrants. And I think in a world in which migrants don't get sufficient protection and attention by and large, and where there's no special category of climate migrants or climate refugees from an international governance point of view, I think they are particularly vulnerable. I think business has an interesting role to play, which it hasn't really stepped up to in particularly the destination countries like the US, which receives a lot of migrants, or like Northern and Western Europe, those countries. And basically the business community, at least based on the experience in this country, is quite happy to receive migrants. In fact, they need them for the labor force. A lot of the northern countries have an age imbalance in their populations, and they need people for the workforce that migration traditionally has provided. And layered on top of that is the competition, or at least the imagined competition, between migrants for labor and people who are in the existing labor force in the receiving countries. I don't think our business community has been out there forceful enough, making their views known publicly. I mean, they may talk to political leaders behind the scenes, but they haven't provided the kind of public leadership that's necessary for the average people in the receiving populations to understand that migration provides an immense positive benefit to many countries. And until they step up and actually play that role, you're going to continue to have contentious situations, as we currently have over the migration issue in the United States. Of course, it's cyclic. There are times in which the influence of business in terms of a consumer of what migrants have to offer has essentially dominated U.S. migration policy, and we've had relatively open door policies within reasonable limits. Now we're in a more contentious situation, and I think the business community, at least here, and probably the case in parts of Europe, could play a better role in interpreting the benefits of migration for the average person, the average current resident of those countries. And that's one thing that they could do. Another thing they could do is look at the capabilities and interests of the migrants that are coming in and think about how they could take advantage of those and orient their current business plans in order to take advantage of the fact that there are these people who have tremendous skill in certain areas that might be different than what is available in the country where the business is operating. And again, sort of orient their business plans around trying to take advantage of those skills to the benefit of both the migrants and the economy of the country that they happen to be in the first place, without necessarily doing damage to the quality of life and the ability of labor opportunities to people who already live there. I think this can be a win-win situation, and if it's ever to be viewed that way, the business community has the ability and therefore probably the obligation to do something about it. Migrants come into a country, they try to adapt and be accepted by the communities that they've come into. And sometimes that's successful and sometimes it isn't so much. And sometimes they establish their own communities, which have very long-lasting the communities survive as dominated by the migrants sometimes for long periods of time. And then sometimes the migrants are absorbed eventually and they're indistinguishable. And what the migrants, however, do when they sort of stick together, which is, an easier way to get acclimated to a particular country. I don't mean with regard to climate, I mean with regard to culture. You'll find these communities have long-term stability in some cases. Like, for instance, in our country, one example is Vietnamese fishermen along the Gulf Coast of the United States. They have both the necessity of learning how to adapt into the particular situation. And for instance, if you take the Gulf Coast, this is the area that's most subject to hurricanes. The immigrant community can teach each other, as the new migrants come in, how to deal with the situation, and they can serve as a lobbying force to get the attention of the governments on protecting those communities. And they can also provide models, both for people from their own country, but for other Americans on how to deal with it. So, for instance, migrants that might come from the Philippines, where there are typhoons striking all the time, have some special knowledge about how to deal with that kind of situation that many Americans or Europeans don't have. And how you deal with intense storms, well, they're used to do it on a regular basis in East Asia. They're much less used to it in the United States and in Northern Europe. But as the climate changes, we're all going to have to get used to it. And that kind of knowledge can be quite useful. So it's both learning how to act together, both with the community that was there for a long time and the other new arrivals, on getting the resources they need to protect themselves from climate change. And resilience building is absolutely critical to that. But it's also bringing the special knowledge they have from wherever they came from on how to deal with conditions which are adverse from a climate point of view.